Princess Zelica was born beneath a moon so full and bright that even the village elders claimed it sang. From the moment she took her first breath, the kingdom felt a shift. It was as though something old and sacred had returned to the royal line. Her mother died bringing her into the world, but the midwives whispered that it was not a death, but a gift, that the queen had poured all her strength into the girl, and that the child would grow to be not just a ruler but a legend. Zelica did not grow up with pomp or indulgence. Though she lived in a palace of polished marble and gold-framed mirrors, her father, King Jabari, raised her with discipline and care. He taught her to read not only the sacred scrolls of their ancestors, but the hunger in a starving man's eyes, the tremble in a soldier's hand, the quiet sorrow of a mother who had buried two sons. A ruler must see, he often told her, not just what is in front of her but what is hidden, and what others wish she would ignore. By the age of 10, Zelica was already attending council meetings, her small hands folded in her lap as she listened to generals debate borders and ministers argue over coin. She never interrupted, never asked a question during the heated discussions. But later at dinner with her father she would ask why the Western Road was still unpaved despite funds, or why food tariffs were harsher on widows. Her questions were not childish. They were precise, probing, unsettling. By 14 she had already gained the loyalty of the palace guards, the kitchen workers, the horsemen, the old gardeners in the courtyards. She would listen to their concerns, offer suggestions, even help solve problems her father's ministers considered beneath their notice. People began calling her the Golden Heir, not only because of the sunlit tone of her skin or the bright cloth she wore, but because everything she touched seemed to flourish. King Jabari, long widowed and without another child, took comfort in her strength. He began publicly declaring her his successor, rewriting ancient protocols that favored male heirs. "She is my blood," he told the elders. "And in her veins flows not just royalty but the future." Not all were pleased. Among the nobles, whispers festered like rot behind the silk of the court's smiling face. Some considered Zelica too bold, too clever for a woman. Others feared the changes she might bring, the traditions she might rewrite. But it was Lord Baruti, a distant cousin of the king and chief advisor to the treasury, whose envy burned brightest. Baruti had long fancied himself a future king. Though his blood claim was weaker, he believed that with the right alliances, with time and patience, he could convince the court to elect him should anything happen to Jabari. But Zelica stood in his way, brilliant, beloved, and already chosen. No plot, no bribe, no political maneuver could shake her foundation. So he turned to shadows. In public, Baruti praised the princess, toasted her health, offered her trinkets from his journeys. In private he summoned the apothecary. Not the one who served the royal family but an outcast, a healer once banished for using roots that caused visions and madness. The man's hut lay beyond the forest, where the birds never sang. Baruti brought gold and a promise. "I need something that leaves no trace. Something slow that mimics illness. Let the kingdom weep while it kills her." The apothecary gave him a vial of dark green liquid that smelled of rotting flowers. 3 drops in her drink once a week. No more. It must be slow, or they will find you before it finishes. Baruti nodded and left the hut with death in his pocket. Weeks passed. Zelica, as radiant as ever, began to change. First it was the fatigue. Then the sudden fevers that came in the night and vanished by morning. Her laughter grew less frequent, her steps slower. The palace healers were baffled. "No wound, no poison, no sickness we know," they said. But Zelica only smiled weakly and told her father not to worry. "Perhaps I am simply growing too fast. Even the sun tires sometimes." King Jabari cancelled foreign trips. He sat beside her bed each evening, feeding her soup, brushing her hair. He did not weep, not in front of her, but his eyes grew shadowed, his voice hoarse. When she collapsed in the courtyard one morning, he ordered the entire royal garden destroyed, thinking perhaps a cursed flower had taken root. But nothing changed. Baruti watched from afar, his face a mask of concern, his heart thumping with triumph. Soon he thought she would be gone and the path would clear. Soon the kingdom would need a new heir. He had already begun convincing other lords that the king, in his grief, would not last long either. But Zelica was not an ordinary girl. One night, as her vision blurred and her bones ached, she dreamt. In the dream she stood in a garden of thorns. Her mother stood at the center, whole and radiant, holding a goblet. "They feed you death," the queen said, "but you are the daughter of dawn. You must not fall." When she woke she could no longer speak. Her tongue felt heavy, her lungs thin. But her mind burned clear. She summoned her nursemaid with gestures and asked to be given only spring water drawn before sunrise, and food from the east garden, untouched by anyone else. The nurse, loyal since her birth, obeyed. Slowly Zelica's decline stopped. She did not grow stronger, but neither did she grow weaker. Baruti panicked. He doubled the dose. Then tripled it. But she no longer drank from shared cups. And then one day she called a royal gathering. Pale, thin eyes ringed with exhaustion, but standing. The entire court watched as she took the throne beside her father. She raised a shaking hand and summoned the royal apothecary. Before them all, she whispered something into his ear. The apothecary nodded grimly. Then he raised a vial, one he had found hidden in Baruti's chamber, identical to the one in Zelica's own bloodstream. "This," he said, "is death. And it was meant for your future queen." Baruti tried to flee, but the guards were already behind him. The court erupted. Nobles shouted, some in horror, some in fury. But King Jabari raised a single hand and silence fell. He looked at Zelica and for the first time, tears slid down his cheeks. "Forgive me," he said, "for letting snakes sleep beside us." Zelica said nothing. She simply stood, walked toward Baruti and looked him in the eyes. He trembled. "You could have served the kingdom," she said. "Instead you tried to rule its grave." She turned and left, robes brushing marble, her crown of golden beads shining like dawn. The people who saw her that day would speak of it forever, not as a moment of vengeance but of resurrection. Zelica did not return to full health. Her body remained fragile. But her mind sharpened. Her voice, when she spoke, carried weight that seemed older than time. The crown was placed on her head a month later, in a ceremony simple and sacred. The people chanted her name not as a ruler, but as hope itself. For the rest of her reign, none dared raise poison against her. Because it was said, by those who served the throne and those who feared it, that even death could not digest the golden heir. Mondo arrived at the palace gates under the golden dusk, a quiet figure draped in fine travel-worn robes and a smile that bent just enough to appear harmless. Few remembered him, only that he was some forgotten cousin from a branch of the royal family so distant it had long fallen from favor. But he came bearing gifts, speaking in sweet tones, and offering stories of distant lands that the court found strangely captivating. The king, weary with age and distracted by preparations for Zelica's future reign, allowed him to stay as a guest. Zelica, in her grace, welcomed him without suspicion. At first, Mondo behaved as expected. He laughed at court dinners, complimented the queen's gowns, and listened to advisors as if their words were scripture. But what he studied most closely was Zelica. He watched the way she addressed the servants with dignity, how her words soothed tensions in the council room, and how the people lit up when she walked among them. Her command was not forced, it was earned. That terrified him more than swords or sorcery. Power that drew people willingly was the most dangerous kind. And Mondo wanted it. He began to linger near her during council sessions. When she trained with the royal guards, he watched from the shadows. When she visited villages, he would conveniently appear days later, echoing her promises and gestures of goodwill to gain favor of the locals. Slowly he wove himself into her routine, careful not to seem overeager. Zelica, ever trusting and raised in love rather than suspicion, saw him as a curious relative returning to his roots. She did not see the calculation in his gaze. While the palace admired his charm, Mondo disappeared on moonless nights into the forest at the edge of the kingdom. There, beneath the twisted branches of ancient fig trees, lived the Witch of Red Roots, an exile with knowledge no man should seek. She had lived long before Zelica's time and had taught kings how to make enemies forget their names. But her price was never gold, it was always intent. And Mondo came with the intent to steal a crown without raising a sword. The witch looked at him with her clouded eyes and said, "You want the sun dead so you may cast your shadow across the land." He bowed, neither denying nor confirming. "Poison," she said, "is the coward's dagger. But it sings in silence and silence often wins." She gave him a tiny vial of green gold liquid, no larger than a raindrop. "This must touch the skin near the heart," she warned. "Not the lips, not the mouth. Her blood must draw it in or else it's useless." Mondo took it with trembling fingers, the weight of treachery settling in his bones like cold lead. Back at the palace, he returned to his role of charming observer. He spoke often to Zelica of the burdens of royalty, of how lonely power could feel. They shared meals, stories, and laughter. She even began to confide in him about her fears, how the weight of the crown often woke her in the middle of the night. He nodded, comforting her, all the while plotting how best to place the poison close to her heart. A festival approached, the day of inheritance, meant to celebrate Zelica's coming rule. On that day she would wear the ancestral garb of queens long past, including the beaded ceremonial corset that sat snug over the chest. Mondo, exploiting his growing influence, suggested a gift. "Let me design a sash to be embroidered into your corset," he offered. "A tradition I saw in the southern tribes. They believe in weaving protection and memory into royal garments." Zelica, ever respectful of cultures and new customs, agreed. "It will be an honor," she smiled. He spent days crafting it, using threads soaked in warm oils to mask the residue of the poison. When the time came, he stitched the sash with the green-gold venom hidden beneath the golden embroidery. It would not kill her instantly, but it would slow her heart, dim her light, and draw her body toward death like a tide pulling away from shore. The day of inheritance was glorious. Musicians played, petals rained from balconies, and crowds chanted Zelica's name with a love that could be heard beyond the hills. She stood on the palace balcony, radiant, her corset bound tightly around her chest, the poison sash pressed to her skin. She smiled, waved, gave speeches, and danced. But as the moon rose, her steps grew slower. Her words caught in her throat. And then, before her people, she collapsed. Panic surged through the palace. Physicians rushed to her, unable to explain her sudden failing heart. No wound, no illness, no explanation. Mondo stood among the crowd, weeping with false concern, clutching his chest in feigned grief. "She worked too hard," he told them. "The weight of it all was too much." The king, shattered, could barely speak. A council was called, and Mondo, ever the voice of reason now, stepped into the vacuum of leadership. "Until she recovers," he said, "we must not allow the throne to falter. I shall oversee the governance with the council's blessing." Many agreed, too stunned to object. But Zelica's body did not grow cold. She was placed in the royal sanctuary, where the air was thick with incense and chants. Her breath slowed, nearly imperceptible. Her skin grew pale, but her heart still pulsed faintly, resisting the poison's grip. It was as if some force, held her spirit back from crossing fully into death. In the days that followed, Mondo moved into her chambers. He wore royal colors, presided over matters of the realm, and whispered to foreign allies about preparing for the inevitable. Yet at night his sleep was broken. He saw Zelica standing in his dreams, eyes glowing like moonfire, saying nothing, just watching. The sash, once hidden beneath her corset, now lay curled at the foot of his bed in those dreams, like a snake poised to strike. He woke each time drenched in sweat. One night, he found himself wandering into the royal sanctuary. No guards challenged him. The corridors seemed hollow. When he reached the marble chamber where Zelica lay, he saw something strange. Her body glowed faintly as if lit from within. And her fingers, they had moved. They were clenched, fists closed tight over her chest. The poison's touch had not stolen her, it had only lulled her into stillness. Mondo backed away, fear scratching at his throat. He turned to leave but saw something scrawled into the stone wall behind her, not carved by hands but perhaps burned in by presence alone. "Blood may sleep, but truth never dies." He fled the sanctuary. But the next night the dreams returned. Zelica stood again, closer now. Still silent. But this time her lips curled in a knowing smile, and behind her stood the thrones of ancestors. One by one they opened their eyes. In the waking world rumors spread. Servants spoke of flickering lights in the sanctuary. The sash was never found. And on the eve of the 7th day, just before sunrise, Mondo's crown, placed by his own hand on his brow in secret, fell to the floor. Cold air filled his chambers. And in the mirror, where his reflection should have been, sat Zelica. Not alive. Not dead. Simply watching. Waiting. And the crown turned slowly on the floor, like fingers had brushed it from beneath. The sun shone fiercely that morning, gilding the royal towers in a brilliance that made the city below shimmer like a bowl of firelit jewels. The great feast had been planned for months, a celebration of Princess Zelica's 21st birthday and her formal declaration as the next ruler of the kingdom. The air buzzed with excitement. Markets bustled with traders offering sweets wrapped in banana leaves and grilled meats steaming in spice-laden air. Children sang songs in the streets, and every home had tied crimson fabric to its windows, the color of strength and future. Inside the palace, the long ceremonial hall was transformed into a hall of wonder. Velvet drapes of deep green and gold fluttered in the breeze. Musicians tuned their instruments, their fingers dancing like dragonflies over the strings. The kitchen, a world of its own, breathed smoke, honey, and roasted yam into every corridor. Dancers rehearsed quietly in corners, their bare feet leaving soft prints on polished stone. Princess Zelica stood before a mirror, clothed in royal fabrics woven with strands of actual gold. Her hair was braided in intricate spirals, each twist bound with a charm from different provinces, a symbol of her unity with the land. Her smile, warm yet dignified, reflected her readiness. She had spent her life studying diplomacy, healing arts, and ancient law. Today the people would see not just a princess but the heart of a nation made flesh. As the feast began, nobles arrived in fine regalia. Governors, tribal leaders, warriors from the borderlands, and even wandering scholars all took their seats. At the head of the long table sat King Obesai, older now, his eyes weathered by decades of rule but glowing with pride. Beside him, Zelica sat radiant and poised, offering gracious words to every guest. Mondo, the king's distant nephew, now seated only 3 chairs from the princess, wore a mask of quiet humility. He'd wormed his way into the court with careful precision, always respectful, always helpful. He had charmed the palace with tales from his journeys, especially Zelica, whose curiosity about the world he fed like a patient gardener. But behind that pleasant smile, beneath the robes of imported silk, Mondo held a secret as dark as nightshade berries. Days before, he had vanished into the forests where the wind howled like wolves. Deep among the trees, a crooked hut stood atop roots like curled fingers. Inside lived the forest witch, an exile from the mountain tribes, whose potions hummed with curses. Mondo had brought her a pouch of old coins and a lock of Zelica's hair, which he'd stolen from her brush. In return, the witch gave him a vial, clear, scentless, and deathly. At the feast, Mondo moved with calculated grace. He toasted with every cup poured, ate only what others ate, spoke only when invited. When the desserts were served, sweet plantains fried with honey, mango rice cakes, and sips of a light floral wine, Mondo made his move. Zelica's goblet had been switched. No one saw it. Not the servant boy distracted by a spilled tray, not the guards laughing at a jester's mimicry, and not even Zelica, whose heart was lifted by joy and love that night. She lifted her goblet, toasted her father, and drank. The music swelled. Dancers spun like wind-blown leaves. Laughter rang through the hall, and for a moment, time seemed to bow before her, as if even the stars beyond the roof watched in stillness. Then Zelica swayed. Her fingers curled inward. Her eyes blinked slowly. The color drained from her lips. A sudden hush fell, the kind that thickens the air like a coming storm. The king rose first, rushing to her side just as she slumped forward, her head thudding gently against the table. Panic erupted. Healers were summoned, guards barred the exits, and every cup and dish was seized. The princess was carried to her chambers, where wise women whispered over her and young nurses wept silently in corners. But nothing worked. Her skin grew cold. Her breath thinned. Her heartbeat, the rhythm of the nation, faded into silence. By dawn, all candles in the palace had been snuffed. The drums that were meant to welcome a new queen now beat the slow rhythm of mourning. Mondo was the first to offer calm. The kingdom must not fall into fear, he told the grief-shattered king. We must keep the people safe. I can hold counsel in her absence. The king, overwhelmed and hollowed by sudden loss, nodded weakly. 100 thoughts spun in his mind, none staying long. The kingdom had been built on his daughter's promise. Now that promise lay cold beneath silken sheets. In the coming days Mondo moved swiftly. He summoned the court. He spoke of stability and tradition. He told the people that though grief gripped them, the kingdom would endure. The line of Obesai shall not be broken, he said, for I too carry his blood. At first the people accepted his presence. His words were careful, his posture respectful. But shadows began to gather. Birds no longer landed on the palace roof. Servants began to whisper of mirrors clouding without reason and candles snuffing themselves out. And late at night, when the court was asleep and the halls were silent, some swore they saw a pale figure sitting atop the throne, not Mondo but a girl in gold with cold, empty eyes. Mondo, unaware or in denial, slept well. He thought the crown would soon be his, made legitimate by decree and ritual. He already imagined himself in the royal portraits, draped in victory, the young prince who saved the realm. But he did not see the shadows deepening behind him. And he did not feel the cold breath that sometimes stirred the back of his neck in the dead of night. For Princess Zelica may have fallen, but something of her refused to stay buried. And by the time Mondo would realize it, the ghost would already be seated, not behind him but above him, on the very crown he thought he'd stolen. The coronation was rushed. The banners that once fluttered with joy now drooped like wilted leaves. No choirs sang. No drums echoed through the palace gates. Just hollow footsteps, forced applause, and the heavy silence of a mourning kingdom. Mondo stood at the altar where kings were anointed, wearing robes that didn't quite fit, beneath a crown that felt colder than it should. The high priest's voice wavered during the blessing, his hands trembling slightly as he set the sacred crown upon Mondo's brow. Mondo smiled, but no one smiled back. They called him Protector of the Realm, a title invented to avoid naming him king outright. The people hadn't forgotten Princess Zelica. Her kindness was etched into the memory of every market vendor she greeted, every child she lifted from the dust, every elder she honored at the city gates. The wounds of her death were still raw, and Mondo's rise so sudden that even his allies could barely hide their unease. Yet Mondo relished it. The royal quarters became his, filled with gold-threaded tapestries and mirrors from the coasts. Servants who once bowed for Zelica now shuffled quietly, unsure whether to meet his eyes. He ruled from the high throne each morning, sitting where the king once did, giving orders that echoed across the chamber, yet something always felt off. The crown, ancient and forged of gold and spiritwood, was meant to hum with life when worn by a rightful heir. But on Mondo's head it stayed cold. He dismissed it at first. Perhaps it needed time. Perhaps it was myth. But the whispers came next. They started faint, just beneath his thoughts. A name murmured in the still air of the chamber. Zelica. Then again louder. Zelica. He jerked in his seat one morning, glancing behind him, sure someone had spoken. But the guards stood silently. No one had entered. Soon the throne itself seemed to resist him. When he sat, the velvet cushion felt stiff, unforgiving. He began to sweat through his robes during court, even when the chamber was cool. And worse, his dreams became restless. Shadows curled in the corners of his mind, and a pale figure always appeared, standing beside his bed, not moving, just watching. Her face never clear, but always with golden braids. One night he awoke gasping. The crown had fallen to the floor. He was sure he'd placed it on the table before sleep. But it lay at the foot of his bed, gleaming in the moonlight. He called for the guards, but they found nothing. A servant must have knocked it, one said. But Mondo's room was sealed from within. Only he had entered. The high priest began avoiding him. Ministers whispered more and obeyed less. The people grew quiet, their eyes downcast, their greetings brief. Mondo ordered celebrations to mark his new rule, but they felt hollow. No songs of praise were written. Bards avoided the court. The statue makers delayed his commission. He turned to the old forest He returned to her shack, deep in the thorned woods, where he had once learned of roots that could still a heart. She sat, her eyes like dry wells. You took what was not yours, she said plainly. Now it clings to you. He demanded a cure, a charm, a spell, anything to ease the restless haunt of his nights. She offered him only one thing, a mirror carved of obsidian and a word, look. That night, Mondo stared into the mirror, expecting his own reflection. But what stared back was the image of a girl in golden robes, her skin gray as ash, her eyes glowing like coals. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Then the mirror cracked down the center. He threw it against the wall, but the vision remained in his mind. Her silence was louder than any accusation. The next day the throne was colder than ever. Ministers found frost along the arms of the royal seat, in the height of summer. The court physician could find no explanation. The stone is sweating ice, he whispered. Mondo snapped. He ordered the throne chamber sealed, claiming he needed privacy to pray for the kingdom. Behind closed doors he raged. Tore the red banners from the walls. Smashed the golden cup Zelica once held. He screamed her name into the empty air, daring her to appear. And when silence answered, he dropped into the throne and buried his face in his hands. He dreamed again. This time the chamber was full. Ghosts lined the walls, old kings, forgotten queens. But at the center sat Zelica. Crowned. Glowing. Silent. She didn't move, but her presence was undeniable. Mondo woke with tears on his cheeks and blood under his nails. The arms of the throne were splintered. By day he ruled with fear. Arrested those who mentioned Zelica. Burned her portraits. Changed the royal anthem. But the kingdom remembered. Children still told stories of the golden heir. Mothers whispered her name during lullabies. Merchants swore her face appeared in their coins. And every morning when Mondo sat on the throne, the cold crept higher. First to his shoulders. Then to his chest. Until one day he couldn't rise from the seat. His legs were frozen stiff. His breath fogged the air. and the guards swore they saw a faint, golden figure standing behind him, hand resting lightly on the back of the crown. Mondo wept. Alone, unseen. The throne did not want him. The kingdom did not sing for him. And the ghost of a princess he poisoned would not let him rest. He had borrowed the crown. But now it borrowed him. And it would not return what it had taken. Not until justice was complete. The mirrors were the first to betray him. They lined the halls, polished each morning until they gleamed like still water. Centuries-old frames wrapped around them, carved with stories of the royal line. Victories, coronations, treaties sealed under golden skies. But now they whispered a different tale. Mondo first noticed it in the northern corridor. He passed quickly, late for council, his robes swishing behind him, but the reflection didn't match. His reflection paused. Just for a blink. He turned, confused. It stood there, the mirror version of him unmoving for half a breath too long, the space behind it dimmer than the sunlit hall around him. He rubbed his eyes. Continued walking. Later that day, a servant screamed in the eastern wing. They found her collapsed in front of the mirror chamber, the hall where 20 tall glass panels reflected each other endlessly. She muttered only one word, Zelica, then fell into silence. They took her to the infirmary, but she never spoke again. By the third day, none of the maids would clean the mirrors. One swore that she saw someone standing behind her reflection. Not her, not Mondo, but a woman with gold-threaded braids and hollow, shining eyes. She dropped her cloth, fled, and refused to return. When Mondo asked what she saw, she whispered, "She's watching," and left the palace by nightfall. Mondo ordered all mirrors removed. Shattered, melted, stored in cellars, anything. But they resisted. When servants tried to lift them, the glass trembled. One cracked in their hands. A shard cut a steward's face, deep and clean. That night, he said he heard humming in his chambers, soft and broken, a melody no one could quite place. The next morning he was gone. No sign of forced entry. His room untouched. His boots still by the bed. The palace grew heavy. The air itself seemed slower. Candles burned shorter. Time felt thick. The whisper of silk along stone floors, once a familiar comfort, now carried menace. Ministers left meetings early. Guards stood in pairs, refusing to patrol alone. And every now and then, someone swore they heard a lullaby floating from the broken mirror room, even though the doors were barred. Mondo grew pale. He stopped sleeping in his chambers, choosing instead to rest in the war room, surrounded by guards. But even there, the polished silver maps reflected strange shapes. He covered them with cloths. Ordered torches snuffed. And still in his dreams the humming returned, louder now, closer, soaked in sorrow. One maid, brave or foolish, entered the library alone, holding a candle. She'd been dared, perhaps, or maybe sent. No one knows. But she never came back. When they searched, the candle was still burning on the windowsill. The books lay undisturbed. And in the corner, a full-length mirror stood where none had ever been before. Mondo came himself, robe dragging, eyes sunken. He demanded the mirror removed. 6 guards tried. It didn't budge. They pried, pulled, struck it with iron rods. The glass didn't even tremble. And when they finally gave up, they noticed something strange. The reflection showed no one. No torchlight. No furniture. Just a dark stone room. Empty except for a girl in white standing with her back turned. Mondo stared at the image, breath caught. "Turn it around," he said. They did. Just wood. No marks. No trick. But when they turned it back, she was gone. The humming began that night in full. It drifted from every corner, from beneath pillows, through keyholes, from water basins and ink wells. It was the same melody the royal nurse used to sing to Zelica as a child, back when her mother was alive. The notes were gentle, but each one tore at Mondo's mind like claws. He covered his ears. Slept with cloth stuffed in them. But the tune curled into his skull like smoke. He began to speak to shadows. Asked them questions. Waited for replies. He spoke to Zelica's old portrait, one he hadn't burned yet, begging it to stop. "I did what I had to," he whispered. "The people needed someone. I gave them order. You were too kind. Too gentle. You would have let them eat from your own hands." The portrait did not reply. But he swore the corners of her mouth tilted downward. Then came the weeping. Not loud. Not sobs. Just quiet, steady tears. The sound of sorrow too old to speak. It came from behind mirrors. From deep inside walls. Even puddles on the stone floor rippled with it. No source. Just grief. It followed Mondo wherever he went. When he paced, the sound trailed him. When he shouted, it grew louder. One afternoon he found his crown atop a mirror in the great hall. No one had moved it. He hadn't worn it in days. But there it sat, balanced perfectly on the cold glass. And the reflection in the mirror? Not his. It was Zelica. Pale, solemn, head bowed. But her eyes lifted to meet his the moment he looked. And she smiled. Just barely. Mondo screamed. He smashed the mirror with a silver rod. It shattered, pieces flying across the room. The crown clattered to the ground. But the shards reflected her still, 1,000 Zelicas in every broken edge, each one weeping. He ordered the entire palace sealed. No one in, no one out. Priests were brought. Exorcists. Sorcerers from the Salt Coast. They burned herbs. Chanted. Drew symbols in chalk and ash. But the mirrors returned. One by one. Each morning, another would appear. In his bedchamber, in the halls, even once on the ceiling above his bed. He no longer slept. He talked only to himself. His eyes twitched. His fingers stained with ink from tracing runes into his walls, desperate to hold back whatever haunted him. But nothing worked. Then one morning a child entered the palace. She wore a cloak of red, her hair braided with copper beads. She asked for Mondo by name. The guards, half mad with fear, let her through. She walked straight to the throne room, where Mondo sat slouched and shaking, his crown now permanently affixed to his head like a parasite. She didn't bow. Didn't speak. Just held out a mirror no larger than a palm. And on its surface Zelica's face shimmered, clear, vivid, alive. Her eyes glowed with something ancient. The child said, "She's ready now." And the mirror cracked. Mondo rose, stumbling, the cold now deep in his bones. He shouted for guards. None came. He called for ministers. Silence. The throne room was empty, save for the girl who turned and walked away, leaving the broken mirror on the stone. He bent to pick it up. Blood bloomed on his fingers. That night the mirrors vanished. Every one. Gone without sound or trace. The humming stopped. The weeping ceased. But Mondo never left the throne room again. Some say he sits there still, crown fused to skull, eyes empty, staring into the stone. Others claim he was taken, pulled through the cracked mirror into a place between reflections, where Zelica reigns in justice over her kingdom of glass. And in the palace, sometimes just before dawn, a quiet lullaby hums through the wind. If you follow it to the old throne room, you'll find a girl in golden braids staring into the wall, and for a heartbeat, you'll see your own reflection turn away. The palace lay quiet in the final hours of night, draped in a velvet darkness that wrapped around its towers and cloaked its corridors in silence. Only the faint rustle of wind through the ornate lattice windows hinted that time was still moving. The moon, heavy and full, cast a pale glow across the courtyard, washing the stone in silver. Inside, torches burned low. Their flames flickered strangely, as if caught in a silent rhythm that pulsed with something deeper than wind. Something old. Something watching. Mondo sat on the throne, stiff-backed and wide-eyed. The royal crown pressed heavy upon his brow, colder than it had ever felt. He shifted, trying to ignore the throb behind his eyes, the way the seat beneath him seemed to grow harder, less like a chair and more like stone forged for punishment. His breath came shallow. He had dismissed the guards earlier. He claimed he wanted solitude for contemplation, but truly he couldn't bear their eyes. Too many of them looked at him now with doubt, as if they could feel that his rule was a robe stitched of borrowed thread. The court had grown uneasy these past weeks. Whispers traveled faster than footsteps, and every corner of the palace echoed with strange tales. Candles extinguishing on their own. Dishes trembling. Lullabies humming from locked rooms. And always mirrors weeping fog when no one was near. But tonight was different. Tonight the shadows themselves seemed to lean closer. A sound echoed through the throne room. Not a voice. Not a footstep. Just a weight. A weight in the air, pressing down, bending it like heat distorts the air above flame. Mondo rubbed his eyes, but they did not deceive him. The shadows had thickened at the corners of the room. They did not dance like normal shadows did. They watched. He tried to speak. Tried to call out. But his throat was dry. Each breath scraped like gravel. And the crown burned. It was as though it had grown spikes beneath its golden rim, each one embedding itself deeper into his skull. Mondo clenched the arms of the throne. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Zelica was supposed to be gone. He had watched her fade. He had stood at her deathbed, had listened to the morning songs, had placed the royal pendant upon her cold chest before the lid was sealed. His hands had shaken, but not from guilt, from fear. Fear that someone might notice the green tinge to her lips, the faint burn on the edge of her tongue. fear that the forest witch's teachings would leave a trail. But no one had questioned it. Until now. He rose from the throne, but his legs failed him. He slumped back down with a thud that echoed too loudly. His vision swam. The torchlight flickered, bending shapes against the walls, shapes that didn't match anything in the room. A girl's silhouette danced briefly against the far column. He blinked. It vanished. Then came the singing. Soft. So soft it might have been imagined. But it was real. The lullaby Zelica used to hum as a child. The one the queen used to sing when the world still made sense. The tune that had once calmed storms in his mind now shattered every nerve in his body. The voice floated through the air, not outside, not beyond the door, but inside the room, around him and within him. He turned his head slowly toward the mirror at the far end of the chamber. It was veiled as it had been since Zelica's passing. He had ordered every mirror covered, too many showed her face, watching, waiting. But now the veil billowed as if stirred by unseen hands. The cloth slipped. And behind it, her. Zelica. Not flesh, not fully. But unmistakably her. She stood within the mirror, eyes calm and endless, dressed not in silk or royal garb, but in the same ceremonial gown she had worn on the night of her final feast. The night he poisoned her. The golden stitching shimmered faintly with each breath she did not take. Her hands were folded, her mouth closed, but the song still came, somehow, from her image. Mondo screamed. A weak, rasping thing. He tore the crown from his head, but his fingers blistered upon contact with the metal. The crown clung to him as if fused to his skin. His knees buckled and he collapsed before the throne. Please, he rasped. Zelica. I didn't. I had to. I deserved it. I was next in line. You were too perfect, too beloved. There was no place for me in a world ruled by your light. The singing stopped. He looked up. She was no longer in the mirror. The room grew cold. The fire died. The walls cracked, thin hairline fractures that began to glow faintly like embers beneath skin. And from the center of the throne itself, a sound, the groan of ancient wood, the whimper of stone under pressure. Then footsteps. Bare feet, quiet against the marble floor. He knew that sound. Knew it in his bones. She appeared at the edge of the dais, not walking but rising. Like mist, like memory, like regret incarnate. Zelica stood before him, her face unchanged, her eyes calm. But the air around her shimmered, thick with unseen fire and the weight of truth. She looked down at him. Her mouth moved but no sound came. Still he heard her, inside his mind, deep in his chest. You named yourself protector. But you poisoned your blood to claim it. You buried my light for a crown that does not want you. He wept. Truly this time. Salted tears poured from his eyes, soaking into the red of the throne room rug. He reached out a hand. Please, forgive me. Zelica's gaze did not waver. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her eyes to the crown that now lay tilted beside him. Her spectral fingers reached for it, and lifted it effortlessly. She did not place it on her head. She sat. Not on the throne but upon the crown itself. Asha's form, radiant and ghostly, grew bright as morning light. Her body shimmered, then pulsed. A low hum filled the room, not song but magic. Old royal rooted. She whispered a single word. A name. Not Mondo's. Not hers. The true name of the line of queens, the one carried through the blood of the first rulers, sealed in earth and gold and bone. It was a name of power. A name that shook the pillars of the room. The walls cracked further and the throne cracked down the middle. And then silence. The sun rose. Guards found Mondo curled at the foot of the throne, sobbing incoherently, the crown crushed beneath him, too heavy for any hand to lift again. The throne had splintered. And Zelica's presence, though vanished, lingered in every corner, every breath of the palace. By morning her lullaby had stopped. But the echo of her justice never left. The princess had died. But before sunrise she had risen. And sat once more on the crown. The sun refused to rise on the day the royal court gathered in silence. The great hall of Omri kingdom was filled, yet the atmosphere was thick with dread. Ministers who once debated law now whispered prayers. Warriors who had faced death in battle stood trembling. No one dared sit too close to the throne, for it was no longer just a seat of power but the site of a haunting. Zelica's ghost had appeared. Not just to Mondo in the dark but to others too. A palace cook woke to find her lullaby echoing through his pots. A royal guard felt a cold breeze stroke his cheek when he dared question her memory. And when Mondo collapsed beneath the weight of the crown just before sunrise, her spirit rose, luminous and solemn, seating itself on the gold. Now the court was summoned not to argue law, but to face truth. The king's council had long dissolved into murmurs and factions. But with the kingdom's unrest rising, the Queen Mother herself called for the ancient rite, the trial of shadows. A tribunal of spirit speakers, chosen from the old houses, would summon the dead for one day, through one host, under the witness of flame and oath. No lies would survive. No blood ties could protect. A medium, blind from birth but known to speak with what the eyes could not see, was brought to the throne room. She knelt before the ashes scattered across the marble floor, remnants of Zelica's cradle dress, burned in ritual the day she died. Her hands, trembling, reached to the stone and touched the pattern of grief etched into its cracks. She gasped. "She is here," the medium whispered. Mondo, now pale and gaunt, was bound in robes of judgment, black and red silk woven with threads soaked in lake water, believed to still the tongue of liars. His eyes refused to rise. But when the flames flared blue and the voice of the dead echoed through the medium's mouth, no one could look away. "I was fed honey wine, spiced with herbs that do not grow in royal gardens," Zelica's voice said through the woman. The goblet was handed by one who bowed too deeply, whose smile never reached his eyes. The court gasped. Mondo's shoulders stiffened. My body grew cold before the feast ended. My soul tried to hold on. But the poison was slow, elegant. Learned from the forest beyond the northern hills, where no prince should walk. But Mondo walked there. The Queen Mother's hand shook, clutching the staff of lineage. "Why?" she asked. "Why, Mondo, would you harm the heir? Did you not love her?" Zelica's voice continued. "He loved the idea of rule. Not the duty. Not the people. Only the crown." At last Mondo stood. His face was blank, but sweat pooled at his collar. "This is a spirit's riddle," he said, his voice thin. "A ghost speaks, yes. But ghosts are pain and memory. They twist truth. They cannot judge." The fire turned green. The medium's body convulsed, then steadied. "You wore the crown but never earned it," the ghost said. "Even now it burns you. Because the throne does not forget. It knows betrayal. It remembers bloodlines. It mourns me." One of the judges, an old man whose beard touched his belt, stepped forward. "Do you deny that you visited the forest witch?" Mondo tried to speak. His tongue stuck. "Do you deny that you returned with vials of nightshade and serpent root?" Mondo's knees buckled. "Do you deny that you poured those herbs into the golden goblet yourself?" Silence. Then the ghost's voice cut through again. "I forgive the throne," it said. "But not the theft. I forgive the people. But not the silence." The Queen Mother turned to the elders. "Let the shadow trial complete. Let the spirits witness." One by one those in the hall stepped to the flame. Each dropped a petal, a coin, a lock of hair, signs of memory and truth. And when the last offering fell, the fire stilled. The wind died. And the throne cracked slightly beneath the medium's feet. "The verdict is known," said the high judge. "Zelica's death was murder. The crown rejects the thief." Mondo screamed. Not with words, but with the pain of something ancient tearing from his chest. The crown, which still sat upon a red pillow beside the throne, began to hum. The throne's back glowed faintly with the symbol of the first queen, the guardian spiral, only lit during great reckonings. The ghost spoke once more. "Let my story be carved in light. Let the crown remember my breath. And let no poisoner ever rule again." With those words the medium collapsed. Her attendants caught her, gently laying her down. The flame dimmed. The spell broke. But something in the room had changed. The throne, once cold and hostile since Zelica's death, felt warm again. Asha, the youngest court page, claimed later that she saw petals bloom from the stone near its base. Others said the air felt sweeter. And though no one said it aloud that day, they knew what would come next. A queen had died. But her truth had lived. And her ghost had ruled for just long enough. The children in the village of Nianda knew her song before they could even speak clearly. It hummed from the lips of grandmothers as they stirred pots of millet porridge, from mothers as they plaited hair under the shade of baobab trees, and from fathers as they carved wooden toys by firelight. It wasn't just a lullaby, it was a promise, a memory, and a quiet defiance woven into the wind. She walks when the stars grow cold. Her heart of gold never sold. Crowned in moonlight, eyes so deep. She guards the ones who cannot sleep. They would sing it in rounds, soft and slow like the rhythm of breath. No one had taught it to them, not formally, but somehow every child in Nianda and every nearby village knew all the words. It passed from soul to soul like a flame from torch to torch, never burning out. Long after Princess Zelica's body had returned to the soil, Her story had become more than history. It had become something alive. Not because of revenge, not because of the drama of betrayal, but because her spirit had refused to rest until the truth stood in daylight. Because she had not let poison silence her. Because she had sat, even in death, upon the crown that tried to forget her. In the palace, things had changed since that fateful dawn. The hall where Mondo once sat in stolen power had been cleansed with herbs and song. The throne, once cold and heavy with secrets, now hummed with a low warmth. The spirits no longer whispered warnings, they sang blessings. And each new heir who entered that chamber would pause, place a hand over their chest and whisper thanks to Zelica. A carving had been made into the back of the throne. It wasn't official. No sculptor had been hired. One day the guard simply noticed it there, a face in profile, eyes closed, mouth curved in a calm, knowing smile. Some claimed it was done by a passing artist who dreamed the shape. Others said Zelica's ghost had etched it herself. Either way, no one dared remove it. That face became the symbol of truth, of protection, and of the justice that watches even when unseen. In every village there were stories. A girl who had been wrongly blamed for a theft placed her hand on a river stone, sang Zelica's song, and the true thief tripped and broke their silence. A boy, lost in the forest, followed the scent of hibiscus, Zelica's favorite flower, and found his way home as the ghostly glow of moonlight flickered through trees. An old healer once whispered that in moments of great injustice, he could hear her heartbeat through the earth. Slow. Come. Waiting. And so, her name was not just remembered. It was trusted. It became a prayer said in silence before judgments. A name scratched into classroom walls and into the margins of journals. Girls wore her symbol, a small golden drop shaped like a tear, around their necks, not as fashion but as armor. Boys learned to speak her name with respect, because they knew power did not always roar. Sometimes it watched with quiet, sharp eyes. One storyteller, old as the mountains and twice as wrinkled, told of a night when Zelica's ghost danced through a dream and taught him a tale never told aloud before. In the tale, she stood before her ancestors in the spirit world. They offered her rest. She declined. Not while my name protects, she said before turning to watch the world again. Zelica's father, the king, had passed in peace many years after her justice had been restored. In his last moments, he held the carving of her face, tears sliding down his old cheeks, and said to his final breath, "Forgive me, daughter. But thank you for teaching me that truth waits even when love blinds." The kingdom had grown prosperous again, not from gold or conquests, but from something stronger, a foundation of truth. Every monarch who came after was chosen by both law and spirit, confirmed not just by scrolls and signatures, but by dreams and songs. When the crown glowed on their heads, they knew Zelica was watching. Many who tried to distort the truth, corrupt scribes, greedy lords, false claimants, found themselves haunted by mirrors that showed their own lies. A warning. Not with fear but with firmness. The land had learned that truth, once buried, would rise. Always. In the highlands, elders sometimes gathered and pointed to the sky. "Do you see that one?" they'd ask the children, pointing to a particular star that never dimmed. "That's Zelica's eye. If it winks, it means she sees something brave." And so, the children would act with courage. They would defend the quiet ones, protect the innocent, and sing her song in solidarity. It became more than bedtime melody, it became a code. The ghost who had once sat on the crown had not lingered to terrify. She had not screamed. She had not burned or shattered. She had simply sat. And in doing so, she had reminded the world of something simple and eternal. Justice can be gentle. Power can be quiet. And truth, no matter how long it is buried, will rise with the dawn. Zelica's story wasn't just one of a poisoned princess or a ghostly return. It was the story of choice, to protect rather than punish, to guard rather than haunt. It was a story of a spirit who held love and duty even beyond death. And so, long after her footsteps had faded from the palace halls, her legacy walked with every girl who stood up for what was right, every boy who chose honesty over gain, every leader who ruled with heart instead of hunger. Her song would never fade. She walks when the stars grow cold, her heart of gold never sold. Crowned in moonlight, eyes so deep, she guards the ones who cannot sleep. And every time it was sung, somewhere the wind would shift. A flower would bloom out of season. A stone would warm under a child's touch. And Zelica, golden heir, quiet ghost, eternal queen, would smile again.